Rodney, really curious. I want to, have a couple of chapters, if you will, in our discussion. The first, kind of looking at your earlier life and kind of how shaped the trajectory of where you are today. So maybe talk to me. Start off from Baltimore. I'd love to learn a little bit about the young Rodney in Baltimore. And I'd love to, maybe hear from your perspective some of the lessons that Baltimore taught you, some of the lessons that you learned that have shaped the direction of your life.
Young Rodney. So this is a very interesting question. Thanks for raising it, Bryce. I have to think a bit back to my childhood and growing up in Baltimore. But no, actually, Baltimore has had such a profound impact upon me and shaping me. For those who don't know Baltimore, Baltimore is both this amazing, incredible city with wonderful people, everyday residents, change makers, and it's also a city that has been, really embodies, I think, so many of the challenges that we face in this country and cities. And so Baltimore is a place that is just rife with structural racism, over policing of communities, mass incarceration, particularly of African-American communities, a struggling education system, right? Public education system, I should say. And, I benefited from having parents that were just really incredible and present in my life, working class parents that really demonstrated to me the importance of integrity and work. And I think I bring this up because, particularly in a city like Baltimore, it's sometimes hard to acknowledge the privileges that you might have. So I was very privileged to have just these phenomenal parents that really instilled in me a sense of education and really capitalizing on any opportunities that I might have. That said, my mom was very cognizant of ensuring that I understood that as a young Black male, that the odds against me were high and that I needed to work especially hard. Really this whole theme of working twice as hard and expecting half as much is something that my mother and my parents and just really my family just imprinted upon me. And unfortunately, Bryce, that was demonstrated throughout my early years. My mom really began to teach me how to read at a very young age. I had this challenge as a third grader. I went to public school in Baltimore City, but in the third grade, I had a teacher who accused me of being unable to read and cheating on my assignments. Now, mind you, I had exceptional scores in the public testing and all this sort of things that I can attribute to just my parents really helping me to identify education as something that was really important. Academics is something that was really important. So I had this teacher that accused me of not being able to read and cheating. I was a shy kid. I just didn't speak a lot. I didn't participate in class in the same way. I'm still very introverted, not an extrovert. And so that's having had that experience of being accused of not being able to read and cheating. I was fortunate that my mother, of course, understood that could not possibly be true. And she actually organized some other parents to identify a pattern that this teacher had in terms of falsely accusing young Black boys. I mean, we're Black boys, right? We're in third grade. Yeah. So, and I bring that up because that's a systemic issue, right? That here I am was someone who actually was achieving high levels in school and had a teacher that because of this fact that I was a Black male, really and they allowed for her own biases to come in. And how many other young boys were impacted by that? Yeah, it was determined to be a pattern. And so what I remember from that was just the importance of people being empowered to take stances. And so the fact that my mother and other parents realized that this was a pattern and actively ensured that the school did not enable this sort of behavior any longer was just really incredible for someone my age to recognize and to see. So that's something that was actually a really impactful moment for me.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah. And sorry.
No, and that's helpful context because we talk about sometimes like this notion of community trauma, right? And so systemic racism has resulted in just kind of this trauma, and to where, and if you study trauma, and I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but people react differently, right? You look at the soldiers that returned from Vietnam and those that were able to assimilate back into society and those that didn't, and they had the same experience. And I think you look at like communities of color, places like Baltimore, that didn't define kind of your path forward. In fact, I think on some levels what I'm hearing is this: you had a powerful mother who cared deeply for you and wasn't going to let this happen. And so you had someone in your corner, in third grade. And I think that, that's reflective of, like, fast forward your own career and you're working in Black male achievement and just recognizing the responsibility of everyday people to empower and to use their power for the benefit of others. Because it is a traumatic occurrence. In some of the research and just leading up to this, looking at some of the ways you've talked about your past, growing up as a young Black man, not being easy, navigating police, threats on your life, living somewhere where violence is an everyday occurrence. I mean, like, that's not my experience. And so that has a shaping element to it. And so how then, so your mother, your parents, very, very formative for you. Were there others in your early life that kind of helped you pursue and see a path that's gotten you to kind of where you are today, leading Common Future, having been a consultant at some major foundations, doing the work with Black male achievement? What helped guide that path for you?
Really, Bryce, so many people. And I think this is the thing, is the amount of people that have had a profound impact upon me to get me to where I am today. I mean, it's countless. I mean, many teachers, particularly I've had, again, I went to public school in Baltimore City. I had outstanding teachers, Black women in particular, that just pushed me, challenged me, inspired me, ensured that I understood what my own talents might be, and encouraged me to really be able to shine whatever light I could. And so there's so many people. And one of the things too, Bryce, that I think is really important, I was discussing this with a friend of mine a few weeks ago. There were people who I grew up with who ended up taking different paths in life, right? Who unfortunately, experienced time in prison, did a number of things that I'm fortunate that I did not go down that path. But some of those people were actually ensuring that I did not do those things, right? Some of the peers that I surrounded myself with, who recognized that I might have a trajectory elsewhere in a more positive light, and really kind of protected me and insulated me from some of the things that I'm just really fortunate that I was able to have that sort of support as well. And I think we don't talk about this often enough, about the nuances of the experience that you might have in growing up in a place like Baltimore, where the same thing that might be deemed as a disadvantage might also have like some profound beauty in it as well. And so I think this is something that applies to all of us in our lives. Those are sort of like the unsung people. And so I think it's something that I have discovered in my life, how important that was to have individuals at all levels, whether in school and family, people who were making different decisions, but acknowledge that I might be bringing something different to the table, and they wanted to protect that. That they wanted me to make sure that I had the opportunity to really excel in ways that might bring inspiration to others. And I didn't think about it at that level as a kid, of course. This is only years and years later. And so there's so many people that I can really, affirm were individuals that just supported me. And
that's awesome.
I'm just thankful for it.
Yeah. You once said about your parents, and this kind of shifting into kind of some of your current work, you heard the narrative growing up from your parents: if you work hard, things will work for you. You said, but I witnessed my parents working very hard, and yet I did not see that adage apply to us. What I saw instead were the sacrifices, but I also witnessed the beautiful things that people did every day, kind of what you're talking about, stitching together full lives despite the challenges, and that you walked away recognizing that there's a tremendous capacity for people. But we need to deeply interrogate and work against the structures that work against them. So obviously, I think some of the some of the amazing things that you're working on and the voice that you're bringing to these communities across the country, I think, is the benefit of hindsight, looking back and seeing the juxtaposition of a Baltimore specifically, your home of origin, that has these deeply beautiful things and these deeply tragic things, and to be able to kind of give voice to both and to say they both shape us. So talk to me a little bit about, your work now at Common Future, and the things leading up to that. How does that look? How does that look to recognize, okay, there's this word from your parents that you're hearing, work hard and good things will come to you. And then the juxtaposition of like, well, but there's systemic barriers that limit the ability of good, hardworking people to make it in our society. How do you push that forward? What does that narrative? What does that look like for you in your everyday work?
Bryce, I think it really first starts with acknowledging what those challenges and barriers are. And I think particularly in this generational moment that we're all experiencing, this multi-generational moment actually, with this pandemic, the economic crisis attached to it, or in response to it, this increase in acknowledging the anti-Black racism and racism more broadly in the US. It takes us actually acknowledging what those barriers and challenges are, one. And then for me, and I think this is sort of like what my parents always instilled in me and my family, was to say, acknowledge these barriers and what can you do to put yourself in the best position? Because unfortunately, those structures aren't going to just unravel on their own. And so I take it as a profound privilege to be able to be in the role that I'm in which I can help to shine light onto these challenges, right? Challenges that have persisted for a long time, right, Bryce? So these are not new. People might be just discovering them, but individuals like myself and so many others have lived through them since the beginning. And so I think the navigating it is so difficult only because so few people can truly acknowledge what those barriers are, what those challenges are. And so when I think about the work at Common Future, and I think about my work just historically, where I really prioritize being able to invest in and resource communities, individuals from communities that have been most impacted by racial injustice, economic injustice, disproportionately. Being able to be in a position, I've always attempted to put myself in a position in which I could actually directly invest in and resource really capable, inspiring people. And at no point in my career have I found a shortage of those people. I think this is like the thing that is so profound for me, is that I'm aware of how many just talented, entrepreneurial, impactful people exist. And simply having an opportunity to be able to invest in them and resource them has actually been just sort of the crown jewel of like my career, right? Being able to do that, because unfortunately, as we know, as you and I know, Bryce, and others are really becoming to understand more, talent is equally distributed, opportunity is not.
Yeah.
And so, it's incumbent upon people like myself, you, so many of our peers and colleagues to really capitalize on the opportunity that we have to actually be able to invest in so many people that just have the talent, they have the capability, they just need the resources. And to also continuously shine a light on those structural issues that continue to plague us.
And so what, from your perspective, what is it about this moment that is unique? Because you brought it up. I mean, this has been an issue for centuries against Black people in America, specifically Jim Crow since the early 1900s, leading up to what quiet Jim Crow in the 1980s and 1990s as we look at the change in banking. I mean, things were still around, redlining and such, even beyond the 1950s when it was technically illegal. What is it about this moment that you think is important and powerful? And why do you think more people are at least acknowledging that the white experience is different and that the Black experience has been and will continue to be profoundly impacted by issues of slavery and segregation until these things are addressed? Why do you think this moment is different?
Bryce, I think this moment is different. And I say this as an optimist, or with my hat on as an optimist right now anyway, is not so much because, so to your point, this has been happening forever. And quite frankly, African Americans, Latinx, many people of color have been championing that there has been historic and contemporary barriers and challenges for communities. What I think has happened is because of the pandemic, COVID-19,
Mm,
just the it's such a revelatory experience because it's demonstrating all the cracks in the system, right? It's not, for example, that it's not because there's something genetic about African Americans that make us more susceptible to COVID-19. It's because of the systems in healthcare and health, the fact that disproportionately African Americans and other people of color are on the front lines of certain jobs and employment that put us at risk than other disproportionately. And so people are starting to see more and more like the cracks in the system. I think COVID-19 has really opened up that experience for so many people. And quite frankly, again, you know, African Americans, other people of color have been saying this forever and
yeah.
pushing this narrative. So I want to just bring that up because I think there's a change that we have to see from others.
Yeah.
And I think
Well, you're right. I mean, it has definitely laid bare these cracks. Healthcare, which is intimately tied to economic opportunity and jobs. To, you work in the finance and philanthropy section, right? So it's laid bare some of the issues that have been present. We talked earlier in this season with Maurice and just talking about access to capital, and a lot of the problems that we saw even during Jim Crow have not gone away. Put lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. And so I think the reality is banking has still not shifted to make it more equitable. And that was laid bare as we saw the PPP and the rollout, and how many of our Black communities and brown communities were overlooked and didn't get access initially.
And Bryce, that's a great point about PPP, because it also, quite frankly, the way that it was structured at the beginning, those of us who do this work understood that it was structurally biased, because the way that the SBA program was administered already had biases built in. And so it was also a thing new for so many people, but those like you and I already understood what those biases were, those structural challenges. So again, it was another opportunity for people to get a window in, a view on what's already been happening.
Yeah, and it's hard. And you mentioned optimism. So that's one thing I appreciate about you, just in the midst of all of this, just the optimism that you have for a common future. Because I think it's hard, as you've been in this work for a couple decades, myself as well, you get sometimes a little frustrated that people aren't seeing these things. And then now, as the light bulbs potentially start to flicker, maybe not even completely go off, you're like, yeah, we've been talking about this for years. Where have you been? And it's hard to not have that reaction, because that also puts people in a bad position and maybe pulls them back, causes them to retract. So how do you maintain that optimism that really pushes into a future that we hopefully can realize as a society?
Well, Bryce, as you know, it's very challenging.
I love that answer.
It is very difficult. The reality of it, though, is, and again, I feel fortunate, and this is where optimism comes from. Common Future works with a community of well over 200, 300 individuals across this country, working in communities, Cincinnati, Jackson, Atlanta, many communities across the country that are just, quite frankly, they just continue to persist and build beautiful community. And I get optimistic because I see, if we are able to invest in and resource them, give them power, then there's a lot to look forward to. So I would say the leaders on the ground that we're able to work with, advocates, individuals that work in institutions and systems that really are allies to these individuals, give me so much hope and optimism.
That's good.
And so that's what keeps me optimistic. It's hard, as you say, but there's so many people just doing incredible work.
Well, and so recently, Common Future, you guys changed your name. I think it was actually right before the pandemic hit. So it's probably been a wild ride of that. Formerly Bali. I'm glad you changed it. It was a little mouthful and confusing. But, an economy that works for all and extracts from none. Talk to me about the kind of the evolution of the organization. And you're the CEO. And you didn't start this organization, but your fingerprints are all over it. I mean, everything you've talked about and even the future that you're trying to imagine. So talk to us about what is Common Future and what is it that you're trying to build?
Well, first of all, Bryce, I really appreciate you pronouncing the acronym correctly. Just last week, I had a number of people refer to it as bail.
Let's not go that way.
so I appreciate you, having the correct pronunciation. And, one of the things is that, so the organization will have been around for 20 years next year. So in 2021, the organization will have been around for 20 years. Had a phenomenal historic start. An entrepreneur in Philadelphia, Judy Wicks, was one of the founding voices, really wanted to ensure that entrepreneurs who were working on ensuring there was more sustainable local practice would actually have a voice and would actually be able to help shape narratives and lead. One of the challenges, though, and this goes to your question, Bryce, is that at its origins, I think the organization really had a challenge beyond. It was quite frankly, it was founded by exclusively white individuals with really phenomenal intent, and really the organization and the network kind of grew from that. And so the diversity, the level of inclusion within the organization and its network just was not there. In fact, there was an article written about 2 years ago in Nonprofit Quarterly, really speaking to this fact in which the writer who had attended a conference several years ago, about 800 people, and they pointed out there were maybe 20 people of color at the entire conference of 800 plus people. And so the organization has done quite a turnaround that really was instigated by my predecessor, who was the founding executive director, who I can give so much credit to for acknowledging, along with many leaders in the network and the team, the board, just some of the blind spots that we had as an organization and what we need to lean into to become more diverse, to be more inclusive, to be more equitable. And so there was a lot of transformation that happened internally. And I think this is one of the things that when I think about a lot of organizations, when they make declarative statements externally, one of the things you have to think about is what are you doing internally to reflect what you're committing to externally? And so, there really was the road paved for me to be able to step into my role as an African-American male from West Baltimore. And really we become a much more diverse and inclusive organization and also network. And so to your question, Bryce, really we've prioritized, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color, communities, rural, Southern communities, because we recognize that economic justice, we can't have an equitable economy without first reconciling with the racial dynamics and racism, right? And so from there, we really prioritized leaders and communities that are working diligently to ensure that we're not exploiting and extracting from those who have been historically extracted and exploited.
Yeah, that's great. One thing you do say about Common Future, which I think piggybacks off that, I really have come to really appreciate the name Common Future more and more as I continue to learn more about what you're trying to build and the real purpose, I think, behind the organization. But you said at one point, at the core, I believe that we have mutuality in our downfalls and successes as people. It's not just about interrogating systems and institutions, but building alternatives to replace those failing systems. Because I think that's part of it as well. It's like, there is a place to tear down, but then also to recognize the value of a shared future. And I think there's an invitation there, which I really appreciate as well. It's to say, look, we need to give voice and opportunity to people in places that have not had them, while inviting in folks to participate, to build a shared and common future. How are you able to do that? Because you guys you're a couple of years into your work, and I appreciate you mentioning kind of the internal work first, which I'm sure it's hard work, and now you're moving into the external future of common future. How are you doing that? How are you able to build that shared future where there's a lot of woundedness in the communities in which you work. There's a lot of pain, the trauma that we talked about, and people respond in different ways. So there's a right place for anger. There's a right place for mourning and for sorrow. But then to look and, okay, now how do we move forward together? How do we do that? How have you been able to do that successfully, as I've seen?
So one thing, Bryce, I think to put in perspective as well, when we think about, the shared future, this common future, mutuality, one of the things I like to talk about is we don't realize. So one, globally, we are a majority people of color world, right? In the US, we were quickly become majority people of color as well. And prior to COVID-19, we knew that if the economy continued in the trajectory that it was going, that within the next few decades, 2 to 3 decades, African Americans, Latinx would have very little wealth in this country, around the same time in which people of color are becoming the majority. And so I always like to think about, because we also oftentimes like to think about like questions of racial injustice as like something that, people of color have to solve because it doesn't impact anyone else. Well, the reality is, if we're becoming more and more majority people of color country, and our economy is such in which the majority of people in our economy do not have any net wealth, negative, net wealth, then we actually have a common problem, right? That needs to be solved among all of us. And I think that COVID-19, again, is a window into what happens when we don't consider what is occurring with other individuals that don't have the same experience as us, right? In other communities, when you see the breakdown in these structures. So when I think about the work that we do at Common Future, again, it goes back to an incredible network that we work with. These are individuals who have built up so much trust, spent years building up trust in communities. They're not just fixated on the growth of their organizations. They're really looking at it from an ecosystem approach. They're looking at it, how do I move this community? How do I move the city of Cincinnati? How do I move Jackson? How do I move these places in ways that are about sharing power and providing optimism and hope for people? And so I think, to your question, Bryce, it's really having the trust and working authentically with the folks in our network who understand their communities best. In the same way that I was shaped by Baltimore and have almost an inherent understanding of the city because of my time growing up there and being a part of the fabric, we really identify leaders who have a similar connection. And that enables them to be able to actually understand what their communities need in the moments that they need them, right? So it's Common Future. We don't look at ourselves as an organization that proposes what things need to look like, as much as we listen deeply to those who are having these experiences and have a lot of knowledge to share back with us, and work with them collaboratively to ensure that they can get the results that they believe their community needs. And so I think that's a different approach, particularly as an organization that's national, that a number of national organizations might have, presupposed ideas on what something might look like in a community. And instead, we work with folks that are on the ground, who are committed to these communities, who are part of these communities, who, again, you talk about mutuality, they themselves as individuals and organizations are impacted by what happens in their community. They're not safe. They're not distant from them, those challenges. They are experiencing them themselves. And so I think that is something that is really important. And we see this be successful in so many other organizations.
So your time in philanthropy and in your work in this space, help us understand what needs to change, because I think one of the experiences I've seen is money is power, and so as we talk about giving voice to those who have those experiences and the lived experiences in these communities, and to really back those opportunities. How does that happen? What needs to shift in our thinking and in our action? Because I think philanthropy, to a certain extent, is complicit in many of these communities, and makes it very difficult for a lot of these leaders that you work with to get the attention of either grant makers or the investment community, across the spectrum of capital. What do you need? What needs to change, and how can we work towards that future?
Well, Bryce, you said it. Money is power. Money is power, right? And I think one of the things that we just don't, more and more of the conversation is happening now, but it's still, I think, a conversation in terms of how power shows up in philanthropy. For example, the vast majority of foundation executives, I believe 88%, are white. And we have this belief that there are not people of color, women of color in particular, that can't take on these roles and have these opportunities. Well, that's untrue, right? That's just simply not true. And we have to actually interrogate whether or not philanthropy, as it's currently constructed, is able to distribute power and decision making in the way that it should be able to, right? And so we've not been able to get a sense of what it really means for foundations and philanthropy to really authentically give up power and decision making to those who are most impacted by these challenges. And not only is impacted by the challenges, but actually, I believe that those who are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. And so it really makes more sense to invest in the leadership capability and decision making capability of people who make up the Common Future Network, for example, right? They really do know best. And so, but that's a power conversation, Bryce. And it's really hard to give up the purse strings, right? It's really difficult when you've had an opportunity to make determinations where money goes. It's really difficult to walk that back. And I like to believe that most people who work in philanthropy, if not everyone in philanthropy, got into the work because they wanted to make some good happen. And so I think we have an opportunity now, and we do this at Common Future. A number of the folks that we work with, we see a number of foundations do this, where they're actually beginning to cede power and control to, say, investment decisions, grant making decisions that really implicate and impact communities in which these foundations just don't have a lot of understanding of.
Yeah,
I think that's really profoundly powerful. The other thing I'd say too, Bryce, is that we've got to be able to see philanthropy as an opportunity for catalytic capital, because I think there's a distinction between philanthropy and charity. And I think philanthropy has an opportunity to really make these strategic bets where we can think more than just about the grant making dollars, but is there an opportunity, for example, for foundations and other and donors to think about their grants, their charitable donations as sort of a springboard to building economic power in communities, right?
Yeah, and that's such a helpful distinction, and because I think a lot of times what I hear from foundations, a lot of times the counter narrative is, well, we've got our donors' intent, so there's truth, right? So there is some work that needs to be done on the federal level at the IRS around kind of like the future of foundations. It's a previous episode with Astrid and Matthew, just talking about how we got here in the 1960s and how it's basically not been touched in the last 50 years. So there's definitely some work that I think we need to push forward that would allow kind of an expansive view on what that looks like. But also, to your point, I think you brought up some really helpful ways to say, okay, even within donors' constraint, how can you create grant-making committees or investment committees that are reflective of the demographics of the communities in which you're working? Allow them to give them the donor's intent and say, okay, here are their parameters. Help us make the best decisions. Or like you said, using philanthropy, I love that, the catalytic capital, to think about ways to invest more deeply and to springboard new solutions, new innovation. And they can do that within the donor's intent.
That's right. And even, and quite frankly, Bryce, there are a number of institutions and families that are really interrogating the donor's intent, trying to figure out, are there ways to, again, pull themselves out of it if they actually believe that the donor's intent no longer fits where the world is today, right? And that actually doesn't require, federal policy shifts or anything like that. That actually goes back to my earlier comment about the internal work that has to occur, right? The understanding that needs to occur. So when I think about some of the foundations and institutions and families that are doing this really, this great work of really seeding power and control, they're doing it because they went through a process. They learned some hard lessons, right? Where they concluded that this was actually the best way to move forward. And there may have been some blowback to that. There may have been family members that said, wow, this is not the intent of the foundation. And however, other family members said, this is what we need to do. This is the world that we're living in today. And we need to make sure that we're constantly evolving and being responsive. And so I like to think of this as an opportunity, given all this change that's happening, for us to really, really consider what's at stake. What power do we have to actually make decisions internally in our organizations and within our foundations and philanthropies, and ensuring that we can have a pathway forward that really is about moving the interest and empowering communities that have been most impacted by extraction and exploitation in this economy.
Yeah. Rodney, thanks for your time. So in final, is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners? I think this is coming out next several weeks. So if there's anything you want us to highlight, promote, or whatever, I'd love to give a shout out.
Well, one thing I just wanted to emphasize again, Bryce, to your question about what philanthropy and investors can do.
Yeah.
I think this is really critically important during this time in which there are opportunities for us to be able to prototype and develop different vehicles, strategies that really center the interests of communities that have been most impacted by injustice. And this is what I mean by the catalytic investment piece from philanthropy. What might it look like, for example, if foundations and grant makers and even some progressive investors were to really rethink what it means about preserving their own capital? What if they're looking at about return on investment for communities instead, right? What might it look like? And so we're seeing institutions and individuals make these decisions. We're starting to think about this as an organization. How do we, as a nonprofit, begin to think about how we leverage our own balance sheet to ensure that we're creating returns for community as much as for ourselves, if not more so? And I think that's something that we need to really be thinking about in this moment, not just thinking about it, but putting into action. And so I would encourage anyone who listens to this to think about how they might be able to pilot and prototype, make some small actions that could feed into learning for them to actually do bigger actions.